Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining Haim and I for our annual report webinar. Haim, it's great to see you today.
Hey, Shachar, thanks. It's great to see you too. As you know, we recently opened our U.S. office in Ann Arbor. So maybe next time when you and I are doing this joint webinar, we can do it from the Michigan office.
I hope so too, and you can count me in for sure. This webinar would be based on Upstream's 5th annual report. The automotive industry is rapidly expanding into a vast smart mobility ecosystem, introducing new levels of cyber sophistication and attack vectors. This report covers 268 new reported incidents that impacted the mobility ecosystem, totaling over 1,100 incidents in the last decade. The report covers the current state of regulations, incidents analysis, including threat actors and attack methods, alongside our deep and dark web analysis.
And I will add to that 2022 was also the first year where we saw R155 coming into effect. And indeed, some of the OEMs have already prepared for their first audits. So what we expect to see in 2023, that is going to be an important year in the evolution of regulations, which we're going to cover later. Shachar and I are going to cover later in this webinar.
In the next 40 minutes, Haim and I are going to wrap 2022's automotive cybersecurity incidents and suggest the main predictions for 2023. We're going to talk about advanced EV threats, automotive and smart mobility API risks, and also deep dive into some of the latest regulations. So let's finish with the introductions and go into the details. Haim, can you walk us through 2022's main trends?
Sure. So let's start with the first one. So the first thing that we've seen, if you look at 2022, black hat actors are now behind 63% of cyber incidents. And why is that? There's a massive amount of data, PII, and access points into the vehicle. And that opens the door for black hat actors to access additional targets and other entry points into the corporate networks, as well as the vehicles themselves. The monetization potential is always attractive to hackers.
That's indeed an important trend to begin with, and this is a significant increase from last year.
It is. It's a significant number when we look at 63%. But let's proceed with the next trend, which also represents a very big portion of the total incidents. Shachar, do you know what's the next one? What could it be?
I assume, like most of the times we discuss, it's smart mobility API threats.
Absolutely. In 2022, the number of automotive and smart mobility API related incidents increased by 380%. That's accounting for 12% of total incidents.
This number is huge, especially considering that OEM's revenue is shifting from vehicle sales to data-driven features and applications, with McKinsey projecting these new revenue streams to soon hit 30% of total revenue. These new streams are highly dependent on APIs. And as we all know, APIs make hacking easier, cheaper, and enable attacks on a wider scale. Let's look at what happened this year in the field. At the beginning of 2022, David Colombo demonstrated an attack on multiple vehicles. Unlike the famous 2015 incident we all remember, this time he only had limited access to the vehicles, but he was able to reach dozens of vehicles from the same model. Now, let's jump to the end of 2022. Sam Curry takes a huge step in expanding the scale of potential attacks. He uses API vulnerabilities of a widely used telematics service to impact dozens of OEMs, models, and millions of potential vehicles. It's hard to believe this giant leap happened in the same year, from dozens to thousands of vehicles, from one OEM to many OEMs and car models, all this using only APIs.
That is an incredible figure, but not only that we've seen this growth going from dozens to millions of vehicles. Let's not forget that it goes beyond the vehicles themselves. So if you remember, in September, Anonymous highlighted the impact of mobility API beyond vehicles, and it was the example of this Russian ride-sharing company that was attacked. So no vehicles were harmed in this attack, but the attackers were able to manipulate the API transaction to create massive traffic jams. How did they do it? They took the API vulnerabilities and they essentially ordered all the taxis to the same spot at the heart of the city, which caused putting the safety and the public infrastructure at risk. Now, just imagine the situation. All the taxis are blocking the city. And think about an emergency vehicle, let's say an ambulance trying to navigate through this traffic, making it impossible.
So to wrap it up, in 2022, the impact of API-based attacks has extremely scaled up, and the risks they pose have grown way beyond vehicles.
And so let's proceed to the third trend. And I don't think it's going to come as a huge surprise because the trend relates to EVs. So we've all seen the rise of EVs and how EV plays such a major role in the automotive industry. But what happens with that comes EV charging. And EV charging has now emerged as an attack vector that dramatically changes the way the vehicles are protected. In 2022, attacks against charging infrastructure counted for 4% of total incidents. So you may say maybe 4% is not a very large number because before you were talking about 380 times and 12%. But when we know the investment that is done in EV by governments and other bodies, and we know where the EV market is going, this number is just going to increase dramatically.
I completely agree, Haim. I know that 4% sounds a small thing, but this attack vector deserves some special attention as we witnessed several attacks against charging infrastructure. For example, at the beginning of the year, hackers executed a ransomware attack against EV charging networks in Europe. Drivers weren't able to charge their vehicles, and you can imagine the impact on customers' trust and adoption rate. This is a disturbing attack because it demonstrates how mobility assets become a high priority target due to their impact on thousands of vehicles.
Exactly. And what it means that it's not only vehicle, it means that this now is an issue for many players in our ecosystem. So with that, let's go to the next trend. And you know, the previous trends that we talked about were maybe more publicly noticeable because they were in the clear web. So let's go deeper. So the next trend we saw the data sharing on the dark web has dramatically increased during 2022. And this really requires action by the entire supply chain. In the past year, the Upstream auto threat analyst discovered that there was a 35% increase versus 2021 in information among threat actors on the deep and the dark web. So again, very large number, but Shachar, can you share with us why this is so critical?
Sure, it's critical because with this intelligence, smart mobility players can reduce the mitigation time between discovering a vulnerability or a security breach on the deep and dark web and the time it reaches to the masses and can be exploited by threat actors.
Exactly. So let's move on. And last but not least, safety and trust. They became a major factor in driving new regulation, which may have a direct impact on cybersecurity. So which brings us to the last trend. Regulators are continuously expanding the scope of cybersecurity protection and measures as the vehicles become more and more vulnerable to hacking.
This year, the regulations like R155 and R156 have reached critical mass and are changing operations around the world from China through Europe and North America.
I couldn't agree more, Shachar, because I look at in North America, in the US specifically, NHTSA revised its cybersecurity guideline, and the way they revised it, they were inspired by R155.
So as we mentioned, the regulations became effective in 2022, and we can just imagine the impact they're going to have next year. And now that we have 2022 wrapped, let's talk about Upstream's predictions for 2023.
Yep, I'm sure just like me, everyone is intrigued to learn what are these 2023 predictions.
So I'll start with the main predictions that have already started in 2022. This year, we will probably see shifting of attention to protect against fleet-wide and massive scale attack, like the API-based attacks we mentioned earlier.
I couldn't agree more. What we're going to see is a growing number of attacks that will target fleet-wide access, vehicle controls, and data. And why is that? Because there's a major growth of mobility application and access to massive amounts of data. And that presents malicious threat actors with tremendous opportunities for financial gain. So we're going to see fleet-wide attacks that are expected to increase across the entire mobility ecosystem, especially given the usage of the growing usage of the APIs and its vulnerabilities.
With the introduction of new EV brands and models, I assume we will also see a rise in the number of attacks against these vehicles and their supporting infrastructure, right?
Absolutely, yes, for sure. So we have seen already the attacks on EV charging infrastructure, which we gave some examples before. They're already prominent. They're here, they're happening. But one of the shifts that we're going to see in 2023 is these attacks are going to expand not only to the infrastructure, they're going to expand into the local grid as well. So once we see this and we expect this growth against the public infrastructure and local grid, the entire technology stack that supports EV charging will need to shift its focus to cybersecurity, detection, and mitigation.
Yes, and while the EU and the US have agreed to develop common standards for EV charging, this process is relatively slow.
Yep. So before we head to a Q&A part, I really want to talk about the three last predictions. I think the next one talks about a topic that everybody has been talking about, and it's the subscription services when it comes to the world of automotive. So we know that it's going to be tested this year. Um, we've seen recent OEMs already making plays in that, and we've seen OEMs try to lock features with the subscription fees. We all know the case of the German OEM that announced that they're going to charge a monthly fee for using heated seat. Well, these have not been met with the open arms. That definitely there was significant resistance by the consumers. Yet we do see early adoption of these features, but this was definitely not a positive experience. So the next thing we're going to see in 2023 is the hacking attempts are not only going to be by malicious players or black hatters. These attacks are actually going to happen by the vehicle owners themselves, because they're going to aim to try to bypass these premium costs by manipulating these systems fraudulently.
It's no doubt this topic is drawing a lot of heat and attention. And to mention again, these software-based features are going to present 30% of OEM's revenue in the future.
Absolutely, that's the case. So on one hand, they're going to increase the revenue from that, but on the other hand, they have to be protected against these attacks coming almost from in-house, from their own customers. So let's start the second one. VSOC is maturing. As VSOC is maturing, we're going to see a shift to automation and improved efficiencies. What does that mean? There's going to be a development and implementation of automated playbooks, sophisticated methodology, and we're going to see that grow. The other thing that we're going to see is now we're going to see collaboration between the VSOC and the traditional enterprise SOCs. So this way they will be able to ensure a holistic protection.
Now that the regulation has become effective and the number of cybersecurity attacks is constantly rising, we see more VSOCs across the world. We understand that the VSOC is evolving and is currently at a crossroad, and it can head two different directions. One direction is that the VSOC will couple with the IT SOC to deepen collaboration against new attack vectors, such as API-based attacks. These attacks affect both IT assets and mobility assets. The opposite direction that the VSOC can evolve towards is the VOC, the Vehicle Operations Center, the data that is used in the VSOC and the insights that are generated there can bring a significant value to the functions that monitor vehicle behavior and health, especially when they are expected to support new software revenue streams, as we mentioned earlier.
Absolutely. So when we started this webinar, one of the things we said when we looked at 2022, we almost said this is like the year of R155. This is when it becomes into effect, which brings me to the last prediction. And it has to do with regulations. So next generation regulations are going to be focused on protecting sensitive data and EV charging infrastructure.
Completely agree. Regulators are expected to shift their attention to drafting the next generation of automotive cybersecurity regulations as fleet-wide and EV charging infrastructures attack rise and posing a serious threat to public safety. Governments around the world push forward this transformation and will address evolving concepts like software-defined vehicles and autonomous vehicles. So we're almost about to wrap the report, and we hope we were able to provide you with some valuable insights based on Upstream's annual cybersecurity report. Haim and I would like to invite you to download our annual report at the resources section at Upstream's website. And now we will be happy to answer some of your questions we received before and during the webinar. I'll begin with the first one we received in advance. So the question is, how do you recommend dealing with the latest regulation audits? Where do you recommend to begin? And this is a great and relevant question, and I decided to address it as someone who participated and supported some audits this year. So it varies from auditor to auditor, but the main expectation is to see a foundation for a cybersecurity operation. First of all, the auditors expect to see the ability to ingest and monitor data from your fleet. It can be telematics or IDS data source, for example. Based on that, they expect to see a methodology to deal with a cybersecurity alert. What are the procedures and the actions you take? What we call a playbook, in case you detect an attack in your fleet. And finally, they expect to see a long-term roadmap that shows how the OEM is going to expand this operation to include additional use cases and additional data sources. So to wrap it up in one sentence, start small and simple and bring a long-term vision.
Yeah, I really like it. You start small and simple. I'll proceed with the next one. Let me see that. What are the trends in EV charging infrastructure, specifically related to cybersecurity? Be happy to address this one. So we mentioned this before that EV charging and EV is on the rise. If we look at the most common way that people are charging their EVs today, they're getting into the charging station, pulling by the charger, and then using one of three methods. Either they're using a mobile app, they're using an RFID, or maybe they're swapping a credit card, and that's how they're charging. But one thing that we're definitely going to see major growth in 2023 is the adoption of ISO 15118. Now, ISO 15118 deals with V2G, which we mentioned before, and we talked about the attacks against the grid, which is definitely a trend we see in 2023. But the other thing that ISO 15118 brings us, it brings the plug and charge, which means the experience is a little bit different. The drivers are pulled into the charging station, they plug, and all they do is they plug the charger into their vehicle, and the rest is done by communication between the charging station and the vehicle. And this is one of the trends that we see that requires the charging station to be 15118, the car to be 15118. But what does it do? What does it do as well? It introduces a new attack vector, which has to be addressed by cybersecurity. Hope this answers the question. Let me proceed with the next one. Oh, Shachar, I see it's a question related to one of your favorite topics, mobility API security. Considering the growing threats in this front, do you expect OEMs to limit or disable these connectivity options?
So I think our prediction is quite the opposite, and we mentioned it several times in the report. OEMs and other smart mobility players see a huge monetization opportunity in software and subscription-based features. The standard way to do it in every other industry is through APIs. So if a specific OEM won't offer these connected and shared services, it will be out of the game. Therefore, our prediction is that OEMs will have to expand their connectivity options and will be required to implement a dedicated API cybersecurity solution to avoid data leakage and fleet-wide attacks. We received a lot of questions in the week before the webinar and during the webinar, and we want to apologize in advance we couldn't address all the questions we received. We would like to thank you again for participating in our webinar and spending these 30 minutes with us. Please feel free to download and read our annual report and have a great and safe year.
Thank you all.